Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep again today. This time, we're tackling how Europeans viewed homosexuality, and we're looking at a huge chunk of time, from the Roman Empire all the way through to the end of the Middle Ages.
A long period. And you'd think maybe that it's a simple story, right? Like things just got more and more intolerant over time.
Yeah, that's what I would have thought.
But it's not like that at all.
Really?
Things changed a lot over those centuries.
So where are we starting to get the best background on this?
Well, we have to start with ancient Rome. And, this might surprise you, but it was a pretty tolerant place.
Wait, hold on. Ancient Rome, I always thought that
they were really strict.
Yeah.
It's a common misconception, but actually Roman society had a very different understanding of sexuality than what we have today.
So, how was it different?
Well, same-sex relationships. For them, it was often just seen as a normal part of life, not a big moral deal.
So where can we see that? What evidence is there of this Roman tolerance?
Oh, tons of places. You can look at their literature, for example.
Oh, okay.
Authors like Catullus and Martial would write about same-sex relationships casually. They weren't judging it, just mentioning it.
Not taboo at all.
Nope. And even Roman law didn't really concern itself that much with homosexuality.
But what about that, the Lex Scantinia? Wasn't that a law about homosexuality?
Oh, yeah. People always bring that up. It was a law, sure, but what it actually prohibited is still debated. It was probably more about protecting young men from exploitation than just outright banning homosexuality.
Oh, so not just a blanket, no gay people kind of thing.
Right. Plus, you got to remember that even the idea of homosexuality as a separate identity,
Yeah.
that didn't really exist back then.
That's a good point. It's easy to look at the past through our modern eyes.
Exactly. And for another example of how open Rome was, think about the Exuleti.
Exa what now?
Exuleti. They were basically male prostitutes.
Oh.
And their presence shows you that same-sex relationships. They were out in the open, not seen as inherently wrong.
Gotcha. Okay, so Rome. More open-minded than we tend to think. But I'm guessing things change as Christianity comes into the picture.
You're right, there's a shift. But even early Christianity, their stance on homosexuality wasn't totally black and white.
Really? It wasn't just an immediate, this is bad situation.
No, there was a lot of debate, different interpretations.
Yeah.
It was a more complex time.
I see. So what were some of the factors that were being considered?
Well, the Bible obviously became a central text.
Yeah.
But interpreting those texts, not always so simple. Take the story of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Oh, right. That's often used to condemn homosexuality.
Exactly. But some scholars argue that the sin of Sodom was more about being inhospitable to guests, not about homosexuality.
Huh. Interesting. Like they weren't welcoming to outsiders.
Yeah, exactly. After all, other cities in the Bible were destroyed for the same reason.
Ah.
And then you have the letters of Paul in the New Testament. Those have some pretty direct condemnations of same-sex acts.
Right.
But even there's debate.
Oh.
Some scholars think Paul might have been condemning specific types of exploitation like pederasty,
Which is?
sexual relationships between adult men and boys. He may not have been talking about all same-sex relationships.
Okay, so not all same-sex relationships, but specific types.
Right. It all comes down to how you interpret those texts within their historical context.
Yeah, context is everything. So even in early Christianity, things were more nuanced on this issue.
Very much so. But one thing that becomes really important is this idea of natural versus unnatural.
Oh, okay.
And you start to see that argument used against homosexuality more and more.
That's a big shift from the Roman view, isn't it?
Huge shift.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where Greek philosophy starts to play a role.
Interesting.
Thinkers like Plato and the Stoics. They believed that reason and procreation, those were the most natural human activities.
So anything else was unnatural?
Pretty much. If it wasn't about making babies, it was seen as going against nature.
Were all the Greek philosophers on board with that, though?
Not all of them. The Epicureans, for example, they thought pleasure was natural. No problem with homosexuality.
So even back then, there were different schools of thought.
Big time. And this debate about natural versus unnatural love, this isn't something new. I mean, there's a story from ancient Greece called the Erotes. It's basically a dialogue between a straight guy and a gay guy, arguing about which kind of love is better.
Wow, seriously. They were having these arguments way back then.
Absolutely. Shows you that people have been thinking about this stuff for a long time. Questions of what's natural and acceptable, definitely not new.
It really makes you think about how much we might get wrong when we look back at history.
You got it. And as we move into the Middle Ages, that nature argument, it gets even more tied up with how people viewed animals.
Animals?
Yeah. People then were much more connected to nature than we are.
I can imagine.
They looked at animal behavior as like a model for how humans should act. So if they didn't see animals engaging in same-sex behavior, they thought, well, it must be unnatural for humans too.
But isn't that kind of a jump in logic?
Oh, for sure. Of course, we know now that plenty of animals do engage in same-sex behavior.
Right.
But back then, people just paid attention to the examples that already fit what they believed. They basically created their moral system based on a very limited view of nature.
Okay, so we've got this nature argument building up. We're heading into the Middle Ages. And I think most people assume that the Middle Ages were just, completely intolerant toward gay people, like a constant Dark Ages situation.
Right, and that's where things get really interesting. You can't just lump the whole Middle Ages together. We're talking about 1,000 years. There were definitely times and places with intolerance, but there was also acceptance. You can't make generalizations.
So nuance is key here, as always.
Exactly. So how did people's views get shaped in the Middle Ages? One factor was the penitentials.
The what now?
Penitentials. They were these guides that priests used during confession to decide what penance someone should do for a certain sin.
Penance, like you do something bad, so you have to do something to make up for it?
Exactly. And here's the interesting part. These penitentials often treated homosexuality as a less serious sin than other sexual offenses.
Really? That doesn't sound very Dark Ages to me.
Right. We should say, though, the penitentials were mainly used in England.
Ah, so maybe England was a bit different.
Maybe. So we've got England. What about the rest of Europe? Were there any signs of tolerance toward gay people?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
Oh, for sure. Take, for instance, King Richard I, Richard the Lionheart.
No way. The Crusader King.
Yep. Some historians think he might have been gay.
Wow, okay. Anyone else?
Well, there's the story of John, the Bishop of Orleans. He was involved with a monk.
So even high-ranking church figures could be in same-sex relationships.
Seems so. And there was even clerical love poetry written during this time. Passionate stuff. Shows that same-sex relationships weren't always hidden or shameful.
I'd love to hear an example of that if you have one.
Imagine lines like, "If face has not been able to see loving face."
Wow, that's beautiful. It really paints a different picture.
Right. Now, this doesn't mean there was no homophobia. Of course there was.
Right.
But tolerance existed too. It was a mixed bag.
More complex than we tend to think.
Totally. And it gets even more interesting when you consider the influence of Islam, especially in Spain.
Okay.
Islamic culture back then, they had a more tolerant view of homosexuality. Even used gay love imagery in their mystical writings.
Huh. So tolerance wasn't just confined to Christian Europe.
Nope, not at all. Different cultures, different perspectives.
Yeah.
For example, there's a line from a poem by Ibn al-Farah, a teacher of the Quran.
Okay.
He also wrote homoerotic poetry. He says, "My eyes saw you and my heart chose you."
Powerful stuff.
Right. Really highlights how diverse attitudes were, even in what we often think of as an intolerant time. But here's the question. If there was this tolerance in the early Middle Ages, what changed? Why do we picture the Middle Ages as being so incredibly homophobic? That's the big question. It brings us to the 13th century, a turning point. We start seeing a shift toward greater intolerance.
Yeah.
And not just toward gay people. It was toward other minority groups as well.
Why? What happened in the 13th century?
It's complicated, but a big part of it was anxiety. Society was changing fast.
How so?
Cities were growing. Economies were shifting. The Crusades were happening. Lots of instability, fear of anyone seen as different.
Sounds familiar.
Right, so they needed someone to blame for these changes. And sadly, that often meant minority groups.
Right.
Jews, people with different religious beliefs, and yeah, gay people too.
The classic scapegoat situation.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
So how did this affect gay people specifically? Well, there are some events that really highlight this shift. One big one, the persecution of the Knights Templar.
The Knights Templar, those warrior monks.
That's them. They were super powerful, but eventually people became suspicious. All sorts of things, including sodomy.
So their downfall was partly fueled by homophobia.
It was a factor, for sure, though there were definitely political and economic motives too.
Like they were too powerful, so people wanted them gone.
Right. And remember, this wasn't an isolated incident. There were other cases of violence and persecution. Edward II, the last openly gay English king, he was deposed and murdered.
Oh, wow.
And his sexuality was used against him.
To get rid of him.
Yeah. A stark reminder that intolerance has real consequences. But what about that nature argument? Did that contribute to the shift?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, it became even more important in the 13th century. Popular literature at the time, like bestiaries.
Bestiaries.
Yeah.
Those books with the crazy animal drawings?
Exactly. They were hugely popular, and they presented animals in this very moralistic way, using their behavior to justify human actions.
So how did they use bestiaries to justify condemning homosexuality? Well, even though many animals do engage in same-sex behavior, these books focused on examples that supported their pre-existing beliefs. Like, they might point to the monogamy of certain birds as proof that heterosexuality was the natural way.
So cherry-picking examples to fit their agenda.
Exactly. Ignoring the complexity of nature to fit their moral framework.
That's pretty sneaky. Did they take that even further?
Oh, yeah. Things get even more interesting with the idea of the goddess Natra.
A goddess.
Yep. In medieval literature, she was the personification of nature, and they used her to say that only heterosexual procreation was natural.
So now it's not just philosophers arguing. Nature itself is against homosexuality.
That's the idea. And it was hugely influential, even shaped the work of people like St. Thomas Aquinas.
Aquinas, the big thinker of the Middle Ages.
He was trying to combine Christian morality with this emphasis on natural law.
But didn't he also say that even straight sex that wasn't for procreation was wrong?
You're right. Anything that wasn't open to making babies. Sin, according to Aquinas. He even said it was worse than homosexual acts.
Interesting. So it was more about having kids, not just condemning homosexuality.
Yeah. Procreation was at the top of his moral system.
But that seems, I don't know, a bit unrealistic. People in the Middle Ages had sex for pleasure.
Of course. But Aquinas was trying to create an ideal system, even if it didn't match reality.
A rule book no one could follow.
Exactly. And we see that gap between ideal and real a lot in religious history.
That's true. But back to Aquinas. It seems his ideas about natural law and homosexuality, even though they were popular, still had problems.
Oh, for sure. Lots of problems. His understanding of nature was very selective.
Like we talked about before, the nature argument is flawed.
Exactly. Even back then, people pointed out that Aquinas was ignoring the diversity of human behavior and even what was happening in the animal world.
So people were pushing back, even at the time.
Absolutely. Not everyone just agreed with him. But sadly, even with their flaws, his views on homosexuality became super influential for centuries.
It's kind of wild how long these ideas stuck around.
It is. It reminds us that even brilliant people can be wrong, and those mistakes can last for generations.
So we've gone from Rome to the rise of Christianity to the nature argument becoming stronger and stronger. Where do we go from here?
Well, from this point onward, we see a shift. People aren't just observing animal behavior anymore. They're trying to create a whole system based on this natural law. And Aquinas is a key figure in that.
Right, Aquinas trying to blend religion with Greek philosophy.
Exactly. It's fascinating how these ideas all come together.
It really is. I'm ready to learn more.
Then let's dive into it.
So Aquinas trying to blend religion and Greek philosophy.
Right, he was definitely working within that whole nature framework, but he was also trying to bring in Aristotle's philosophy.
Aristotle, like the ancient Greek guy.
That's the one. His writings had actually been lost to the West for centuries.
Really?
Yeah, crazy, right? But then in the 12th and 13th centuries, they got rediscovered.
How did that happen?
A lot of it was thanks to translations that had been preserved by Islamic scholars.
Oh, wow. So Islamic scholars helped bring these ancient Greek ideas back to Europe.
They did. And their contribution was huge. It really changed how people in Europe thought about, well, everything, including nature and morality.
So how did Aquinas use Aristotle's ideas to build his arguments about homosexuality?
Well, Aquinas was trying to create this system of natural law, basically like a set of moral rules that are supposed to apply to everyone based on reason and what we observe in the natural world.
Okay.
And in his view, homosexuality went against this natural law because it violated the natural purpose of sex.
Which he believed was.
Procreation only. Having babies.
So if it wasn't about making babies, it was wrong.
Pretty much. But hold on, this is interesting. He also thought that straight sex that wasn't for procreation was wrong too.
Oh, really? Like what?
Things like using contraception or having sex just for pleasure, those were all sins in his book. He even said they were worse sins than homosexual acts.
Wow. So it wasn't just about homosexuality specifically, but any sex that wasn't about having kids.
Exactly. He was trying to create this really strict moral system.
Sounds a bit tough to follow.
It was. And it's kind of ironic because, surely people in the Middle Ages had sex for pleasure too.
I would imagine.
Of course they did.
Yeah.
But Aquinas, like a lot of theologians, was focused on defining this ideal even if it didn't match up with how people actually live their lives.
The ideal versus the real. That seems to come up a lot in religion.
You got it. But okay, back to Aquinas. Even though his ideas were influential, there were definitely people who pointed out that they didn't really hold up.
In what way?
Well, like we've been talking about, his whole understanding of nature was super selective.
Cherry-picking examples to fit the argument?
Right. He was ignoring the diversity of human behavior and what actually happens in the animal world.
So even back then, there were people calling him out on that.
Absolutely. Debate was happening, but unfortunately, even with all the flaws, Aquinas' views on homosexuality became really influential in the centuries that followed.
His work kind of solidified these negative attitudes.
It definitely played a role. A good reminder that even brilliant people can be wrong, and sometimes those mistakes have consequences for a long, long time.
That's a sobering thought. So we've covered a lot here, from ancient Rome to early Christianity to the rise of this nature argument and the influence of thinkers like Aquinas. What are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, when you take a step back, I think the most important takeaway is that attitudes towards gay people, they were always changing, always evolving. It wasn't just a straight line from tolerance to intolerance. It's a way more complicated story with lots of twists and turns.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't just a simple march towards intolerance. There were times of acceptance and AD persecution all mixed in.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that our understanding of history is always changing too as we learn more and find new evidence. What we think is a fact today might get challenged and revised tomorrow.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just about memorizing dates. It's about constantly learning and reevaluating.
Exactly. And when we're talking about the history of homosexuality, it's especially important to avoid looking at the past through our modern lens. We have to try to understand each period on its own terms.
So we shouldn't just assume that everyone in the past thought like we do now.
Right. But we also shouldn't shy away from making connections to the present. It's all about finding that balance.
So nuanced thinking as always.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up, was there anything that really stood out to you from all this research? Something that surprised you or made you think differently?
You know what I find fascinating is how the nature argument, even with all its flaws, is still being used today.
Yeah, it's like the zombie argument that just won't die.
It really shows the power of ideas, how they can stick around for centuries, even when they're based on shaky ground.
It underscores how important it is to think critically about these arguments, not just accept them blindly.
Exactly. Because what we've seen from history is that what people consider natural is often more about cultural norms and who has power than about some kind of objective truth. Yeah, it's not just some abstract debate. It affects real people's lives.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand this history, to see that the fight for LGBTQ plus rights, it's not new. It's part of this long story with both good times and bad times. And that history shows us that progress isn't inevitable. We have to keep working, keep pushing for change.
So we can't just assume things will naturally get better.
Nope, we got to stay active, stay engaged. And knowing this history can actually be really empowering too. It shows us that change, possible even when it feels like we're up against these huge, deeply held beliefs. It reminds us that we're not alone in this. There's a long line of people who fought for the same things.
I like that it's a hopeful way to look at it.
Yeah. And as we move forward, I think it's so important to remember that the nature argument, even though it's still around, it's based on this really limited view of human and animal behavior. We've seen that over and over again.
It does seem like the more we learn, the more we realize we need to keep learning.
Absolutely. We have to move past these simple categories and recognize just how diverse human experience really is. And we have to keep questioning those old arguments that try to justify prejudice and discrimination.
Okay, so education, critical thinking, and ongoing activism. Those are some of the key things we can take away from looking at this history. But before we go, is there one final thought you want to leave our listeners with? Something to think about as they explore this topic more on their own?
Here's something to chew on. We've talked about how the nature argument has been used to hurt and exclude gay people for centuries. But what if we flip that around? What if instead of using nature to limit us, we look to it for examples of diversity and acceptance?
Instead of saying nature says we can, we say, look at all the amazing things nature does.
Right. Because when you look at the diversity of life on Earth, it's clear that nature doesn't fit into neat little boxes. And maybe if we can learn to embrace that complexity, we can create a better world for everyone.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for sharing all this with us. It's been eye-opening, to say the least.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, this is just the start. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
Until next time.